Terin Tomadelia, Swiss and Liechtenstein, Permima, Dixugi, Tsokso Sokshe, Tarana Shingi, Chisur Henge, Chunde Maimba, Tsopagi, Tsokso Sokshe, Gule, Antine, Mima, Swiss and Liechtenstein, Permima, Yonglia, Tomadelia, some teachers still issuing. Totari Namshire, Tarana Shingi. Mekorgi kange ribuchige teen sere imbine number 2 changme simshu machabachini tharin delia pe tu badilia ni kuzak thunje legu chapchini number 2 changmalia thoji che shuyen ta tharin sanganju chenjonalia pemichugi penjo nedangi yargere antagana shingi sususu Mezigi, Gundugi, Lingere, Dunzu Sangmalia, Zamri, Hani, Ani Chibegi, Legu Kashilia, Tusho Doegi, Nambashuk Chungu Tungudua, Di Indugalia number 2, Namshi Dinde, Kapuyobine, number 2 Pebadi, Manzumune, Nebardu Nunzi Shugu, Antana Shingi Anzu. Dawa rerelia legu penye yore Koranzu yimbine simshu machachini dawa takpa gunga yarga kangyanere chawagyanere dawa takpa phegire Koranzu yimbine manzu kaduine jesu ira shugye antane shingi peri miman dikzu da chokpa shein da manjawa Swiss and Liechtenstein tabuchi yimbina lochik nalia Nyamde gezogi chondo tengsung chogiore temsungja lolia number 2 peni nyamshu nangudu an thagana shingi jinda chungigi chechu geji domi total legugi nimodilie number 2 pegudu dia tunjo legunchi bu mare yu pemi diksu ne chini kande phoda ne chini changmegi si shu yorela number 2 gi shabji da number 2 gi simshu dilia Shene sungma tubine sem dingne jesu ira shugiore di indugalia number 2 lange kyartu pyogeto ne tik kashe chingmado shiame de imbine dinalia kecheba di number 2 lia toji cheda jesu ira shuyayi andine da ngegi injinalia tik kashe chik shuchogachi. Today on the 76th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, commemorated as the International Human Rights Day, we, the Tibetans across Switzerland and Liechtenstein, have assembled here to not only remember and commemorate the International Human Rights Day, but also to remind the authorities that what is happening inside Tibet is not acceptable. For the last 65 years or so, Tibetans have been subjected to humiliation, unfathomable miseries, and atrocities by the Chinese authorities. Time and again, we have taken up every opportunity to remind the authorities, be it the United Nations or the other international organization, or even the countries, that Tibetans inside Tibet continue to look at the international community in the hopes that the international community will someday speak up, stand up, and protect and promote the human rights of Tibetans, who also are people as defined by the United Nations. What we have seen in the recent times is erasure of Tibetan culture, identity, and Tibetan people. Be it the renaming of Tibet into some other Chinese name, or subjecting nearly 1 million of Tibetan children to forced colonial-style boarding schools. What we are seeing is continuous, systematic, and pre-planned violation of Tibetans' human rights. What binds Tibetans inside Tibet is the Tibetan language, it is the Tibetan religion, and it is the Tibetan culture. In Tibetan schools across Tibet, Tibetan language is not anymore spoken as an instructional language. Tibetan has been banned from Tibetan schools. Tibetan schools that were promoting and teaching Tibetan language have been forced to close down, thereby erasing one important component of what it means to be a Tibetan. Tibetan monasteries are being forced to be closed down. The monastic schools are forced to be closed down. Monasteries are being destroyed. Young monks are being debarred from monasteries. They are being forced to leave monastery and being sent to these permanent boarding schools, thereby erasing another component of what it means to be a Tibetan, that is Tibetan religion. Scores and scores of Tibetan nomads and rural Tibetans are being forced to be relocated into other towns and suburbs. In these towns and suburbs, Tibetans are not being given any skills, any means through which they can live their livelihood, thereby ensuring that Tibetans are dependent on the subsidies provided by the Chinese government. And so, if they ever decide to raise a simple complaint against the Chinese authorities, their subsidies are being removed and thereby being made dependent on the Chinese authorities. Thereby, another component of Tibetan culture is being destroyed. What we have also seen in France, where museums are being forced to rename Tibetan artifacts with some other names, that is now the transnational repression that we often refer to. Tibetans who have come into exile are being forced to follow Chinese diktats. The museums that have no relation to the Chinese government in whatsoever, except, of course, through their collaboration or some business deals, they are being forced to follow Chinese diktat. These are nothing but signs of transnational repression that Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and every other so-called minority of China is experiencing. It is high time now that the United Nations and the countries across the world stand up and say to China, enough is enough. You cannot say that you respect and guarantee fundamental human rights and then in the same breath go ahead and violate every known human rights of Tibetans. On this day of the International Human Rights, we, on behalf of all the Tibetans in exile and inside, would like to call upon the United Nations, especially the Office of the High Commissioner, to ensure that they visit Tibet, see on the ground what is happening, and then report to the international community the immeasurable, egregious human rights violations that is taking place inside Tibet. It is high time now. It is high time for the countries to give up their commercial interests. It is high time for the countries to not speak about human rights and then go ahead and do their business deals. Enough is enough. Tibetans across the world, look at the United Nations and see that this is one institution that can bring change in Tibet. They have failed to do so in the last 76 years, and Tibetans inside Tibet still pin their hope on this institution. And I think it is high time that the United Nations really stands up, the Office of the High Commissioner really stands up and says to China, bring concrete results and implementation of the human rights that the Chinese government has agreed to implement in Tibet. What we have seen time and again is that many authorities really believe that the Chinese government will bring change. But we, as Tibetans, have witnessed in the last 65 years, there is really nothing to hold China accountable unless the institutions, the governments, and the United Nations comes together and calls on China to stop its atrocities. With these few words, maybe once again, I sincerely urge the United Nations, the international community, the countries, the platforms like the EU, to really think through their policy that they have held dear with regard to China. They really need to incorporate the human rights in their policy and ensure that Tibetans inside Tibet finally get to breathe the free air that has been promised from long. Thank you.